What is up, guys? It's your boy Aniki. We're doing a scriptless video on Overhaul for this. I just decided I want to do this, so we're going to dive right in. One of the things about Overhaul that I really liked is the way that he's structured to be paired with Shigaraki in such a way that you can see so many parallels that even if you reread the Overhaul arc, you can realize that he has almost the exact same backstory, even without us seeing him destroy his family or anything like that. Both are found mute. Both are found by legends of the old guard, or at the very least, villains of the past. Villains who are technically past their prime, are on the decline. Villains who are struggling to make ends meet to a certain degree within the context of their own personal views. With, obviously, All for One grabbing Shigaraki and the Yakuza boss grabbing Overhaul. The difference between these two, though, is that Overhaul's boss is more or less a reflection of the old times, since before even Quirks, whereas All for One was, the chosen one, the evil villain, the demon king of Quirk society. And that kind of influences the way the story handles the two of them, right? You see, Overhaul decided that he would become the next AFO. This seemed to make sense to him. He had the ability to gain power, he had the plan, he had the knowledge, and more than anything else, he already had an organization that was structured around him, and he had been chosen by a boss to become the next king. So in his own mind, it was the natural right and of succession for him to step into that place, knowing that he had a powerful quirk to handle quirk-based society. He was developing the tools to take down quirk-based society, and from the era before quirk-based society, he had been given the blessing of. The issue here, though, is obviously that in the same way that Mirio was chosen by All Might, the actual king of that era, Shigaraki, was chosen by, All for One, the actual king of his era. And that's kind of reflected even in the fight with Mirio. Mirio, who was chosen by Night Eye, someone who was stuck on the ways of the past, stuck on how things should have been in his eyes, because that was what made his childhood and his growing up better. He decided that that's what the world needed, so he decided Mirio was going to be the next big thing. And Mirio takes on the older ideology, old school thought of charging in first, being the one hero there. Now, one of the things that's interesting, though, is that Mirio chooses to fight Overhaul in the same way that All Might would approach fighting All for One or many of these other villains. And Overhaul fights Mirio in a way that All for One kind of talked about his own subordinates and his people. If you think about how All for One talked about people, they were always, some of them were his friends, but he always made it sound like they were people that he could kind of use and exploit. But he also does seem to genuinely value their loyalty. That is something that is contrasted in Overhaul, in which he literally named them the 8 precepts of death, but also the 8 expendable bullets. This kind of comes into play with also the fact that both he and Shigaraki are perversions of religious symbols, and that Shigaraki is meant to be a Christ-like figure paired with stigmata, and Overhaul is meant to be a perversion of the Buddha. Except in this case, now let's think about in Buddhism where you're trying to achieve harmony, balance, and peace. In this case, Overhaul wishes to achieve harmony and balance by removing quirks, which do in fact stratify society. He is tackling inequality in society, but he's doing it for the wrong reasons. Just like each of the 8 precepts of death end up being perversions or counterintuitive to different principles of the Buddhist teachings that lead to nirvana. So when you have the Buddha versus the Jesus figure, you have to ask yourself, what did each of them promise? What Overhaul was offering Quirk Society was basically just a reset. He didn't really address the things that people who would have been felt, mired by society would have really need tackled. Whereas the savior of Shigaraki is coming in to wipe things clean, make a new start, very reminiscent of the apocalypse or the end times in the book of Revelation. Now, what Chisaki wanted to do, though, however, was a little more selfish. Not more selfish than Shigaraki, but rather his whole goal was just to make society revolve around the Yakuza and to achieve, the old days once again. Now, that promise is not one that is nearly as inspiring as the liberation and freedom offered by Shigaraki if you are in his camp. Furthermore, the way Shigaraki decided to use his allies is akin to All for One, but he does not value his allies the same way that Shigaraki and All for One did. And that's also part of his downfall. Ultimately, looking at people as expendable leads him to trying to throw anything away, throwing anything at any chance just to focus on getting away. When had he fought with his people, he probably could have wiped out all the police officers right there, taken out a good chunk of the heroes too, just by spiking everyone and calling it a day. Yes, that would have made him incriminated, but at the end of the day, it was already known. The bullets were already discovered that the genetic material was made from Eri. So the reality is, destroying everyone and just going further underground would have probably been better for his operation than him choosing to throw everyone away. This is something that Shigaraki highlights, or at least shows that he's not interested in doing during My Villain Academia, when he talks about how he's just going to destroy everything and bring salvation to his friends. Something that you can either join and believe in the Savior and be saved, believe and be baptized and you can be saved is a tenet of Christianity. Believing in Shigaraki, following his path, being his ally gets you salvation. Being with Overhaul does not necessarily grant you salvation. It just simply allows you to be a part of what he deems as balance. But looking back at their childhoods, this kind of makes sense. Shigaraki, whose quirk was effectively defined him, was the ultimate case of Overhaul being right, by the way, saying that quirks are a disease, and then looking at how Shigaraki's quirk is a manifestation of destruction that literally wires him to be effectively allergic to things that irritate him, things that aggravate him, causing him to go on wanton destruction rampages, or he will be on the ground scratching, vomiting, and in intense pain. You can even see similar parallels in the way Overhaul's quirk manifests, but because he has a healing factor, because his quirk is more balanced, because it can restore and destroy, his consequences are a little less severe physically. He only gets slight rashes, but he still gets itchy. You can notice little bumps that form on him. And in the same way, though, instead of being about destruction, though, he is about order. He has, as it's called in Soul Eater, the madness of order, or just obsessive compulsive disorder. He wants things to be a certain way. Things need to be clean. Things need to be orderly. Society is plagued because these people aren't focused. They're not using things the way they should be. Everybody's quirks causes them to have crazy ideas, go against the grain, do silly things, even judging other criminals as beneath him, even though he's more or less the same thing, doing organized crime to take people out. But he specifically resents the Reservoir Dogs because they only shot small. They didn't have big enough ambitions. They weren't good enough. Their quirks just made them sick and think they could do more than they actually could. This is something that, even though he only talks about the heroes in this regard, it is also reflected in the lower tier villains. So if Overhaul is right in this sense that quirks are a disease due to the way they affect people's psyche, then we can at least acknowledge that also ultimately there does have to be a cure. When you look at someone like Shigaraki, your only two options are killing him or giving him the quirk bullet. You see, we've talked about quirk rehabilitation within the context of the society, and from this point, we should say individuality rehabilitation, because that's what the original translation is, because that hits a little harder because you're trying to rehab the uniqueness out of a person. So when Overhaul wants to get rid of diseases, he's literally been taught by society, not only in the books that said it was carried on the backs of mice as a virus to infect humanity, but society itself has already deemed certain quirks as a disease, as an illness, as something to be treated and maintained. If you've ever read some of the spin-offs and hero team-ups, for example, there was, also, heads up, team-ups is not technically canon. It's moreover about a representation of certain character interactions to give you what those dynamics would be like if they played off each other. So there's a chapter where you end up getting a mission with Bakugo, Mirko, Deku, and Ochako. And there's a villain attack where they release gas very akin to mustard. And the solution in that ends up being is letting him release his toxic gas, but really high in the air so that he doesn't poison anyone, and then Bakugo explodes it. But the whole point of this is that his quirk effectively was poisoning him. If he didn't release the gas, he would get sick. But if he did release the gas, everyone around him would get sick. There are certain contingencies that come with these quirks that literally make them nothing but a burden for people. So the idea that quirks are a disease is something that has been highlighted time and time again throughout society. And now what you have here, though, is you can either embrace your illness, accept that you have it, and you have to live with it, or you can try to treat it. You can try to, do things to get around it. And I think to a certain degree, even Overhaul himself probably resented his own quirk. I wouldn't be surprised if it turned out that he simply accidentally splattered his parents, or destroyed the house, or accidentally turned it into a bunch of spikes. Because when we find Overhaul, he is a mute child walking the streets. Same exact situation as Shigaraki. Why is a 5-year-old just walking through the streets with no one to take care of him? Perhaps it was a dangerous quirk manifestation leading to him being isolated, resenting his own quirk, and that quirk resentment now being projected onto all other quirks within society. this would actually make a ton of sense for him to become so resentful towards these quirk factors and all these other things. Now, that being said, because he hates quirks, because everybody has them, because everybody's diseased, everybody's expendable, those are the people he can throw away. And that kind of leads into his ideology and the way he handles things in his industry. Whereas, again, Shigaraki is someone who has decided to completely embrace his quirk, completely embody his quirk, go ahead and be about destruction. He technically has a more simple path in the way it affects his mindset. I think a lot of people underestimate the way that these quirks do impact your like psychology and physiology to a certain degree. So, like All For One and all these other characters, when he's faced with other heroes, he has to make decisions. Now, let's look at the way the Mirio fight truly went down and how it was handled, and even the visual storytelling that kind of went within it. Because you had Mirio charging forward, doing what, specifically if you think back to the final exam arc, which I know a lot of people don't like as much, but you specifically see All Might fighting 4 villains. Like, it's about 2 or 3 of them in front of him and another 2 behind him. Think back to Mirio, the way the fight was set up, he had left about 2 people in the hallway behind him, and then he was facing Chronostasis and Overhaul in front of him. So even that fight is like a callback to smaller things within the moment to build up towards these things. Now, All Might was capable of facing anyone alone and with his quirk, and in the same way, Mirio was basically untouchable, a truly peerless hero, as he was referred to. But once, he lost his quirk and he was still stuck fighting on his own, things start to crumble. Notice that the wound that he gets is a abdominal wound in the side on the opposite side of All Might, showing that while he's similar to him and that he's taking on this burden by himself, running ahead, the blonde, powerful guy that makes everyone smile, he's still finally, damaged. He's being taken out of the combat. And then more than anything, he is also forced to live like All Might, and that he loses his power and is forced to watch society go forward without him while he is benched. He is basically All Might Jr. to the T. Now, the reason why ultimately he isn't going to work out is because, just like the Yakuza boss who was caught in the past, Overhaul's, just like Night Owl was caught in the past, Overhaul's boss was caught in the past. They were both instructed and thought to think like the past. That's no longer going forward. Even if Overhaul technically embraced some of the more modern concepts of allowing people to fight for him, it was only out of desperation that he gave the bullets to Neto to make the shot. It wasn't because he truly trusted him. He just needed someone else to help him as he was getting dog-walked. That's just kind of the reality of the situation. Those fists were crushing all of his friends around him. So we see both of them fail, though, ultimately, because of the fact that they still embodied so much of the old ways. So Overhaul was never going to be able to be king because he was always thinking small, even if it seems like his plans were so grandiose, because he was tapping in a market. He was trying to do all these other things to make money and focus. And Shigaraki's goal and Deku's goal has never been necessarily directly tied to the financial aspects of being a hero, but moreover to the idea of just succeeding, exerting your will, making that dream a reality. In a sense, having the plan kind of backfired on Overhaul because he couldn't see beyond his own selfish ambitions and himself achieving these things. Same thing that happened with Mirio. He couldn't wait for others to catch up to him, and that leads to him, his downfall. So Overhaul now, where we look in the story, throughout the arc, you get the characterization that he's heartless, he's cruel, but then you get the final emphasis towards the end of the battle when he's losing to Deku, when he's really being crushed down by the weight of unity and the weight of the future that is to come, because at the end of the day, that was the big thing about that arc. Can you change the future? What is the future going to bring? What are the consequences of the future that is heading towards you? And when Eri rewinds Deku, and they're basically using the power of rewind to change the reality that is the time stream, or however you want to look at it, because I'm still not 100% sold on Night Eye being able to see Eri, a future with Eri's powers active, which is part of why I don't think that necessarily All Might gets to live. You understand why he had to lose there. Now, Overhaul is currently sitting in prison, no arms. His quirk is apparently somewhat adjusted to his new body. But the reality is that Overhaul's views on quirks being a disease are highlighted throughout multiple characters throughout MHA. And I think it's important to note that the reasons that he failed have more to do with what he has in common with Old Heirs and with Mirio and All Might, and to a certain degree All for One, than what he has in common with Shigaraki and Deku. So even when you look at the age gaps between Mirio and Overhaul, it mirrors the gaps between Shigaraki and Deku. Overhaul is unfortunately a rightful successor chosen by the wrong person, in the same way that Mirio is a rightful successor chosen by the wrong person, because both of those people were hung up on old school ideologies and stuck in their ways, especially the Yakuza boss. You remember, he was willing to let everything die just to stick to his old ideals, in the same way that All Might was willing to tear himself apart just to focus on his ideals, in the same way that All for One was, up until he started losing to All Might, completely stuck on being powerful forever. So I think Overhaul is just a character that, like many others, like even Mustard, for example, is a character that when you watch NBA, when you read NBA, when you read the Paranormal Liberation Front, you see the way that these characters are impacted by society as you go forward. You can realize that even Mustard was a character that, due to quirk discrimination, due to quirk classism, was resentful towards UA students for the same reason that a lot of people hate private school kids sometimes, where they're just like, you're a bunch of uppity rich kids that are privileged, that people automatically assume and place on a pedestal in comparison to us. Whether it's a lesser quirk in the case of just a harmful gas that you can spread out, but at the same time, Mustard was validated in his eyes because, yes, you guys assume everybody at UA is automatically the top tier student, but I, with my gas alone, one-shot 15 of them. So every villain throughout the story has been calling out hero and quirk-based society, and I think that Overhaul specifically was designed and placed where it was to show us what the root cause of the problem, being that quirks do in fact impact your body and do function like a disease. They cannot be treated as just superpowers, as many people like to see them as. They need to be looked at as an anomalous illness that can have benefits, but it can always also harm you. And even when you have a cool quirk, there are still medical downsides. If you are Endeavor, you have the badass power that is Hellflame, but you also have the badass condition that is overheating, having strokes, having fevers, losing brain function because your body cannot handle the burden of your power. The same thing even with Shigaraki's decay. Yes, it also affects his mental state, but it can literally start to tear his skin apart, cause him to crack apart. All of these things have clear negative downsides that cause them to behave in certain manners or to offset the things. Hell, changing gravity can cause Uraka to vomit. So I think it's just, Overhaul is a character that I think we should really go back and kind of look at what he was saying, where it was coming from, and then make sure you tie in where it all fits in with the rest of society. Because yes, you have at the end of the day, the promise of salvation, the promise of liberation, the promise of freedom, the fact that Shigaraki is more or less a savior down to the stigmata in his hands to promise absolution for his people is what gets them behind him and what leads to his success. It's what makes him, the chosen liberator versus Overhaul, who only seeks balance, who seeks to create like a harmony or a nirvana that he sees, a peaceful society where quirks are basically being eradicated. And the thing is that is most important about Overhaul is that I believe the bullets he made are going to be crucial, not only in this current arc where we've seen Bakugo have to shoot one, where we've seen them get thrown at a racer and he's had to chop his leg off, but his bullets will be instrumental to the end game, because at the end of the day, we cannot have a society where a person's only option is to poison themselves like the child in Team Ups, or risk harming society, where a child's only purpose is to go into rehab and then basically be forced into a massive state of repression until they go into a psychotic snap like Toga and they have to go stab someone and drink their blood. Or someone like Shigaraki who's laying on the ground, itching, scratching himself. At the end of the day, the quirk erasing bullets need to become, not seen as a bad thing, but seen as just a step in the direction to make sure that if you have a quirk that you do not want to live with, if you do not want to carry that burden, you should be allowed to take it away from yourself. And because if your quirk, for example, just makes you covered in spikes and you want to just go about your day and not have to spend money on clothes every single week because you're constantly, just ripping things apart on accident, you should have that option. In fact, we've even seen during the beginning times, as much as quirks have become normalized and glorified, there were plenty of people who would gladly get rid of their powers. There was a child who even made it a point to give his powers away because he wanted to take care of his ill parents, but they were scared of him because of the fact that he all of a sudden was turning into a monster in front of them, and there were people who wanted the power. So there's going to be some people throughout the story who lose their quirks, who don't want to lose them. That's inevitable. That's going to be coming up. And then for those people, there will probably be a cure. The cure will be used, the reversal bullets, because we know that there was a cure and a completed serum. Both were finished, so I have a hard time believing that the doctor would not have replicated these. So that's kind of where the end game of the story is going to have to be. Quirks are going to have to be treated both as a blessing and a curse, and people are going to have to decide on an individual level whether or not they agree with Overhaul and that their quirk is a disease and they want to get rid of it, or whether they take the path that Shigaraki has done, where they embrace it and they consider it a liberating factor and go forward from there. So that's all I got to say. Share, like, subscribe if you like what I had to say, and be here on Sunday for the Church of MHA. Aniki out.